Hello, one and all, and welcome to an episode of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, on to the final day of spoiler reveals and such. Pretty much, they revealed the whole set. I'm going to cover the rest of the cards I didn't cover the last few days, just to essentially get them covered. I was waiting till the final cards were revealed because I was hoping some last minute, really saucy cards would come in. Granted, the majority of them were just commons as suspected. There is one uncommon I did want to talk about later, but besides that, we're just going to talk about the cards that I think will be kind of really cool that I haven't discussed yet, that I think will be cool for constructed. I am going to skip the limited stuff, but I will say if you're looking more for a limited perspective on this set, I would recommend stuff like the Mana Leak or Limited Resources, just for the record. But this is more for standard slash also EDH, so keep that in mind. Nevertheless, we're going to start with probably one of my favorite of these modal slash mythic spells slash land cards that is essentially a spell on one half or shock literally a not even a shock land, a bolt land as we like to jokingly call it. This is definitely my favorite of the bunch, which is Agadim's Awakening. It's in free black, so it's pretty pricey, but what do you get? Well, you get a sorcery spell, and it says, return from your graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that each have a different converted mana cost, X or less. So for clarification, let's say X is 2. So with the way when you cast a spell, from your graveyard, you can return a card that costs 2, a card that costs 1, and a card that costs 0 that are creature spells. Just for clarification. Now, the land-sided portion of the spell is essentially, as we stated before, it is Agadim, the Undecrypt. It's a land, you have a choice of paying for your life to make it enter in tapped. So, why do I like this a lot? Well, the reason why I like this a lot is I think this is the secret card that kind of makes Mono Black in Standard really, really good. Let me explain. Now, technically speaking, Mono Black have been trying to find a way to become a brew, kind of like how Mono Blue is. People who've seen Mono Blue played and such, using the stuff like the Lotus and such, and being able to untap, tap, and such, and generate a lot of mana. And while Black doesn't have really any way to do the untapping, they still have relatively decent mid-range to early game plays. The problem is that they do have the Nits Lotus in play and such, they don't really have a, say, payoff, so to speak. They do have some decent late game spells, but they don't really have stuff like, you can't really play Ugin in that deck or stuff like that. They don't really have a late game play. The thing is, Agadim's Awakening, while both can be used as a land if you need to, is actually a really, really decent late game spell. Because let's think about this for a minute. Let's say, for example, your board got wiped by Shattered Sky. Let's say it was kind of like your typical board, like with Auroria. Like, let's say, 2, lower cost creatures, and let's just say a Gary, for example. Great Merchant of Athelsdale, for those who don't know the quote-unquote shorthand. Well, what happens is, if you're late in the game and you can cast Etz 5 for 8 mana, because hopefully you have hopefully you ramped enough to the point that you can actually get to the 8 mana, which there are ways to do that, I shall say. You can actually then return all those creatures, have all the ETB triggers happen, and that's like the best case scenario of Etz 5. I can even see some circumstances where you can just put Etz free and it's perfectly fine. Because you return stuff like Auraria, a 2-drop, and a 1-drop, you still get the peens from Auraria, which then helps drain the opponent's life a little bit more. So, there's that. And also, I kind of like this card in potentially, I wanted to say free colored decks, but I would say if you're doing free color, make sure the primary color is black for, well, obvious reasons, or either that or you're playing like a Chromatic Orly or like a Mana Rock of some sort. But in like 2-color decks, this is also a really good reanimation spell as well, so. And the best part is, this is one of those ones where you can have this as like a backup plan, but you don't necessarily have to have it as your total game plan, and still just keep it as, simply put, a land that you can cast late, a land you can cast early if you need the mana, but if you need like a massive reanimation comeback to help essentially build up a board state, here you go. Plus also combo shenanigans if you go into a self-mill strategy and just reanimate a ton of stuff that has powerful ETBs. There's a lot of potential for this card. Do I think it's the best of the bunch? Some people are saying yes. As much as I love reanimation, I'm going to say a little bit maybe. I still think the red one and the green one are probably the best of the bunch in my personal opinion. But do I personally like the black one and is it my favorite? Yes, without a sweat. Next up, another really silly mythic from the set, and this one's quite a doozy, especially since Ramp can still be pretty good in the meta. Ancient Green Warden, 4 and 2 green for an elemental 5/7 with reach, because of course it needs to have reach. It also has the ability you may play lands from your graveyard. That's really good. Oh, and also if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So in other words, all your landfall triggers are going to trigger double. Like let's say you have a Lotus Cobra on field. When a land goes into the battlefield, you get 2 mana. How am I going to phrase this card? The card's really nutty. I know some people are kind of looking at this and being like, wow, this is going to be a great EDH card. Granted, yes, this is going to be a really great EDH card, especially for those decks that need like Crucible World style effects. Plus, it's also safe to not to remiss at the factor that the Moto spells that we've been talking about that are part a spell, part of land. The factor is that this actually synergizes with those spells because technically, if you cast a spell portion and the land's in the graveyard, the portion of it, aka the Moto flip cards in the graveyard, you can just play it as a land from the graveyard since it's been clarified that if anything says you can play the card, you can play it on the side you prefer. So you can play a land from the graveyard. Hey, technically it's a double-sided card that has a land portion. You can play the land portion from the graveyard without a sweat. And that's a really nutty thing to consider, especially when you consider the implications. I'm probably going to post a link of it, but there's this one deck that I have seen because people with the set coming out, they've been doing a lot of theory crafting and brewing. I'm forgetting the name right off the top of the bat, but you'll probably see the name of the brewer through the link and such. But they thought of one of the most silliest brews along with this card and all the landfall triggers, as well as with Nahiri's, that Etz Nahiri spell we were talking about where you sacrifice Etz lands and draw Etz card. And it's one of the nuttiest combo decks I have seen in a while. Here's the combo. You essentially have Ancient Green Warden, and you have Lotus Cobra on the battlefield. Maybe you have a Dryad on the battlefield or some shtick like that. Probably, preferably a Rada, if you can. But anyway, what happens is you cast Nahiri's for, let's say, let's go with best case circumstances. Let's say you just played a land on turn 7. You get a mana from the Lotus Cobra, so you're casting it for, say, about 4. Let's just say about 4. You could, or actually, wait, it's 2 mana generated from the land, so technically that would be 8. So technically that you can actually cast that for 5. Okay, so you're going to sacrifice 5 of your lands, draw 5 cards. Well, by the way of how this is worded, you can actually take the lands you sacked and replay them from the battlefield. Yes, they enter in tap, but you gotta keep in mind that you can actually quote unquote play lands from the graveyard thanks to this ability, as well as generate 2 mana from the Lotus Cobra that you preferably still have on the battlefield, so you're gonna generate a lot of mana. And in theory, I'm still trying to configure the process of the deck, but essentially the basic premise is you're gonna try to draw your entire deck, make Rada into a ridiculously big creature, and cast Fleeing and fling the Rada to your opponent. That is probably one of the nuttiest applications I've seen with this card. So, yeah, this is going to be a card that I think is going to see a lot more play than people take at first glance in Standard. 1, ramp is still really good. 2, if the Moto / dual land spells that we've been seeing get a lot more popular, then I do think this is just a great comeback mechanism just to be able to give a second use for your Moto lands if you don't use them as lands, but use them as spells first. Because, hey, you have this on the battlefield, you need a land drop, boom, play the land, play the spell from the land, and then put on to the battlefield. Plus, also, if you have landfall triggers, enough said. So, yeah. This card is really good. You're obviously going to see this play in EDH, but I'm not going to be surprised if a competitive standard deck comes about because of this little bugger. Well, actually, I can't really say little bugger, but big bugger. And of course, there's Uro you got to keep in mind. So, okay, there is actually one con to the card now that we mentioned the Uro clause. Technically, with Uro, you want to exile cards from your graveyard. So, technically speaking, Uro and Ancient Green Warden theoretically could be kind of a nombo if you're brewing your deck to a certain extent. But besides that, I really like Green Warded. It's a really good card. Next up, we're going to talk about kind of one of the lands that many people, when they saw it, they were kind of went from a big to a big, and it's Base Camp. Now, if we forget that little piece of text that's on the top, let's see what it does. It can add 4 colors, neat, but also you can add 1 mana of any color. You spend this mana only to cast a cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard spell, or activate an ability of a cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard. So this is the party-based land. And it would be really great, but the problem is it enters the battlefield tapped. Oof. But even then, I still think this card is going to see play. Keep in mind, cards like Prismatic Vista had seen play in the past, and cards that, or not Prismatic Vista, I'm thinking not the fetch land, the pretty much stuff like the gate cycles, where it's like you put the land in tap, and then you have to pay a mana to essentially make sure it doesn't sacrifice itself and stuff. Those lands. So the fact that people, if they need to splash for a third or fourth color, will be willing to play those lands from time to time. Base Camp, the way I see it, it's one of those type of lands, but you don't have to worry about sacking a land to keep it on the battlefield. I think a lot of people have just been kind of negative on the fact that it is interested in tap, which, yeah, granted, it doesn't really help the tempo-based party decks or early game aggro party decks because tap lands are something you really want to be very cautious of using, but I really think this is more two things. One, I think this is more for the mid-game to like late-game party decks and mostly for draft. And also, if you want me to give a personal guess of why this interest in tap, it's probably because this card kind of died, and I'm saying died in quotation marks here, because of Lotus Cobra. Because Lotus Cobra with this effect is kind of silly when you think about it. That's why they're probably going to be very cautious of putting in kind of like mana confluence style type of land designs, is what I'm going to guess. Because Lotus Cobra is a card which then allows you to do multicolored designs in theory. Like, for example, you can play Base Camp in like a only Warriors deck, and let's say this had not the top part of its text, but let's say that it was like a Gruul Warrior deck. And if it could enter and untap, well, all you have to do is simple. Just play a Lotus Cobra on turn 2 and then 3. You can play then this land, get an extra mana, and then get out like a really big warrior for about 5 mana. Or, stuff like that. So I feel like that's the main reason why this land is a little bit less powerful than other lands that have this support a mechanic base. And I'll say this, I kind of like this for a flavor perspective personally, because they're at the base camp. They're chilling. They're not ready to go out yet until they're ready to go out, so to speak. So I do kind of like it from a flavor perspective, if I'm being honest. They're camping out. They're not going to the battlefield yet. And then once this is ready and then the land is ready to be used, then they're ready to go out. I kind of like it from a flavor perspective, I'm going to be honest. So, if you're a mid-range to actually kind of like maybe even a combo-ish, or even just a late-game party deck, I think, especially if you have multiple colors, yeah, play this card. Don't play it like maybe a full playset, I would say play 2 to 3, but you're going to relatively be fine with this card, in my personal opinion. But if you're an aggro or a tempo deck, I would be very cautious of using this card. And in draft, obviously, you play this card in draft, especially if you are doing any of the party-based mechanics. Next up, I think people would be mad or be a little bit concerned if I forgot to mention about this card. Soaring Thought Thief. Demir colors, a blue and a black for a human rogue that's a 1/3 with flash and flying. That's really good. And also, as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, rogues you control get +1/+0. So all your rogues, if you're playing a rogue travel deck, gonna get a +1 boost, so this is a lord. Oh, and whenever one or more rogues you control attack, each opponent mills 2 cards. Yeah, if you're going to make blue-black rogues, you are probably going to play this card. I actually think this card is legit good. This card is actually very legit good. Because here's the thing. The problem is a majority of the milling with the rogue decks, you have to have the 1-drop in play. The guild, I always forget the name of the card. The 1-drop that came from the core set, essentially. And then it synergizes when your other rogues enter the battlefield to do the milling engine. That's kind of how they originally did the mill engine before, besides other than throwing in a couple of other semi-mill cards, per se. But Soaring Thought Thief is, in a sense, another way to actually encourage the mill engine, which is what the deck kind of needed, especially if it wanted to put its more powerful spells within the deck design, such as stuff like Drown in the Lock, or even like they could maybe even run that 11 cost spell, I think it is, the one that makes you draw 4 cards, but then costs ridiculously cheap if you put like 10 cards in the opponent's graveyard. You may even have an excuse to put in the Loch Ness Monster style card and such with that. Granted, you want to make sure you still get a lot amount of rogues for this effect to work, because you want to have it where one or more rogues are attacking to get the mill effect in. So the factor that we still have a lot of good rogues in the format, I mean, Brazen Borrower, enough said, I do think this is the final key to actually making the rogue deck work. Now, is it going to be a powerful deck? Possibly. I do think it's a very possible thing, because there is a lot of good payoffs. There's a lot of good ways to keep tempo. They do have a way to do card draw engine, and they just have some really, really powerful late game spells when you think about if the blue black roads deck essentially becomes blue black mill, because blue black mill was a deck that was still kind of in the tier 2, maybe even could say tier 3 in some instances, but the road package might upgrade the tiers just a teeny little bit. Plus, I can't remiss the factor that if you get the Lord effect and you have a wide board state of rogues, well. Oh, and by the way, as we mentioned with the Moto land, like the first card as I mentioned, the Aghadom's Awakening, this is one of the rare decks that might actually be able to run 2 of those of Aghadom's Awakening, because, yeah, using that to replay your entire rogue board state when it gets wiped and such, and also get all the ETB triggers as well as the mill triggers from it. Yeah. So yeah, Soaring Thought Thief, really good lord. Obviously, it's the draft kind of like signpost card, but even in standard, this is going to be a pretty powerful card, especially with Flash, and just all of those abilities are relevant for the archetype you want to play this in. So yeah, great card. Next up, a card that I think is going to be kind of overlooked, but you should really never underlook these cards. Thundering Rebuke. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. 1 red for a sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Honestly, Lava Coil has been a popular card in the past, and yes, this doesn't exile, but the fact that it gives you the clause that you can target a planeswalker, that's actually going to be very powerful, especially since we are getting a lot of powerful planeswalkers in the format, or already have it in the format. And of course, this is also a semi-answer to an Ugin that's been used as a board wipe. So, I think the Planeswalker clause in this card is going to be used a lot more than previously taken at first glance. Now, granted, yes, we have the Mono Red spell that can be used as a giant burn spell, but there are some times where you just have to remove a threat just like that. And I think in any sorcery speed control deck that maybe just wants to run a few removal spells of this variety, they're going to like this card a lot. So, maybe as a 2 of, maybe as a 3 of, but I think you should run this at least as a 2 of, and then maybe like the red kicker spell, potentially. The one that you can kick it and deal like 5 damage, I think it was. I'm forgetting the name of the card, but you know which one I'm talking about. But yeah, never underestimate these type of cards, and of course, yeah, probably sees, well, actually, maybe not EDH play, coming to think of it, because there's probably a lot better options, but for standard, it's really good. Next up, one of the more powerful 2-drop black drops I have seen in a while. No Priest of Oblivion. 1 in a black for a 2/1 vampire cleric with kicker 3 in a black. It has minutes. It has lifelink. So an upgraded Child of the Night. But wait, there's more. When this enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Yeah, this is a really, really, really good card. Let me explain. Now, here's the thing. Really good kicker cards are cards that both are good on both sides of them. The really not great kicker cards are the cards that you want to make sure you kick. Some of them are not bad if you are forced to just kick them, but really a great kicker card is a card that you don't mind playing if it's not kicked. And this fits perfectly as a really good 2-drop that you don't mind having to kick, that you don't want, that you can play on turn 2 without a sweat. A 2/1 with Menace and Lifelink, that's very good. Like in the Menace Tribal deck, this is going to be a nice addition. And even just in the Vampire decks and Pioneer and Historic, that's a good addition. And just the Menace and Lifelink helps you, just that lifelink gets you incremental life gain, which could help you against burn. Which then makes opponents are scared because they might want to shock this and such. And the turn 2 threat to make opponents scared of shocking it, that's something to consider. Plus, the best part of this card, when you draw it late game, it's still a really great card. Like spending 6 mana to get this creature along with probably one of your best cards in your graveyard that's a creature, that is nutty. Like a 4 mana reanimation spell from your graveyard is nothing to underestimate. So, yeah, you can use this kind of like in your typical mono black deck. You can also just use this in a combo deck where you're wanting to reanimate something ridiculously big if you discard it in the graveyard through a method or through milling. Yeah, this card is really good. This is one of those cards where it's going to be probably your standard 2 drop that you're probably going to see in a lot of decks that have black in them if it's not the blue black rogues deck. And even the blue black rogue deck, I can make an argument of at least sliding in at least 1 or 2 of these because never underestimate a really cheap reanimation spell. That's all I'm saying on that one. Nevertheless, really great kicker card. Probably my favorite kicker card of the set, if I'm being honest. Next up, a Lord for the Warriors in everybody. Kargan War Leader. 1 in Boros for a human warrior, 3/3. But a warriors you control get +1/+1. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this card kind of hit the nostalgia, if I'm being honest, because one of my original decks I played during the cons block was the Warrior Tribal deck. And it's just nice when you see a good Lord for the Warrior Tribal decks. And yeah, you do see Boros Warriors currently in Standard, like either some of them are going through the Paul Blade variation, or they're just going through the Mardu Winota variation, or a combination of the both. So the fact that we have this card as a Warrior Lord, both in Limited, but also in Standard, really nice. Now, if there is one con to the card, it is a free drop, so it can be hit by Elspeth Conquer Steph or a lot of removal in the format. But let's be frank, when you're playing Warriors, you're not really worrying about the spot removal. You're just playing a creature, swing. That's pretty much what you're doing. You're playing creatures and swing, and those type of decks love Lords. And, well, this is just a really good Lord, so yeah. I like this card, especially for the Warrior-based shenanigans that might come of it, let's just say. Next up, a Simic card that's not broken! Moving on. Okay, no, I'm just joking. But still, it's not broken, which is great. Verisol the Split card. So it's Etson, green and a blue for a legendary creature serpent. It's a 0/0, but it enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counter on it for each mana spent to cast this. You wondering why the weird wording there? This is mostly for commander, since with the commander tats you have to put 2 extra on it. So it actually helps contemplate you having to pay the commander tats by just still being able to get some extra counters on it. So we're clear on that. And then it has, so it's essentially Et's mana, you put that many counters on it, so what do you do with it? Well, granted, let's me clarify, it's Et's +2 because it does count the green and the blue, I should add, so keep that in mind. But it has, whenever you cast a kick spell, you may remove 2 +1/+1 counters from Verisol. If you do, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and also a copy of a permanent spell becomes a token. Okay, I do like this card for EDH a lot, if I'm being honest. This is kind of one of those cards where I think it's going to be a fun brew round. I know a lot of people, when they play the kicker deck, they try to play the red-green variant with Halar, I believe was the red-green kicker legendary. But I do like this as an option. I do like that this is kind of like a second choice if you want to go in the kicker, because, to be fair, while there's some really good red and green kicker spells, there's also a lot of good blue kicker spells. There's stuff like Into the Royal. There's even like stuff like the new Jace, for example. And we're getting a lot of other blue kicker cards that might actually be very powerful in a Verisol EDH deck. We also have powerful kicker cards in the past that are within this color, so I feel like this is just a commander where you can just essentially go into the blue-green variation and do some funny shenanigans. Like, heck, you could maybe even throw this in a Hierarch deck where maybe you do Hierarch kickers and such, and then do the ETB triggers of the kickers and such, which is actually kind of funny now that I'm thinking about that. But that's just my Jake brain brewing there. As for standard, it really depends on if a blue-green kicker deck can work. I don't see it off off what I've seen so far of the set, of pretty much the whole set being revealed and such. But if you want to try it, you can go ahead. I do think the blue green does have enough ramp, thank you, Uro, as well as cultivate and such, that you can definitely try a kicker deck of some sorts that's in the blue green color pie. You can maybe even go into Sultai and get some of the better cards that are also in black and run all the kicker cards that we have that are the inscriptions. So yeah, you can definitely try out that deck. I don't know if it's a competitive deck per se, but I do think it's going to be a fun deck to at least try out. So with Verisol, the Split Current, it's a Simic card that is fun, but it's not busted. Thank you, Watsy, for not a broken Simic card. Thank you. Next up, one of the more weird but potentially powerful cards of the set, Myriad Construct. 4 colorless, so you can spend any mana to cast it, but it also has a kicker of 3. So, what does it do? If Myriad Construct was kicked, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each non-basic land your opponents control. Okay. Also, it has when it becomes the target of a spell, note spell, not a spell that an opponent controls, so it could be a spell that you target with, keep that in mind. Sacrifice it and create a number of +1/+1 colors construct artifact creature tokens equal to its power. So, yeah, let's just go through the steps here. 1, in EDH, absolutely, especially if you're going to go wide like Brutaclad deck. Because here's the thing, in EDH, a lot of people play non-basic lands. Like, a lot. So, the fact that you can actually kick this and get this to a significantly big power is ridiculously absurd. Like, you could probably get this up in theory 10, maybe even like more to 15 power. A lot of people play non-basic lands. You would be surprised how many non-basic lands are played in Commander when you actually do the count and such. Now, granted, it will be dictated based on your play group. Maybe your play group plays a lot more basics because maybe somebody plays back to basics or like Blood Moon or something. So you got to keep that in mind. But if you're in a play group that plays a lot of non-basic lands, this card is actually really good. For standard, there's a potential, I will say. I mean, it's a 4 mana 4/4, and a 4 mana 4/4 is fine. I'm going to say it. It's fine because it does block the Questing Beast, and the fact that it does have the death trigger on it, where you essentially get, if you just play this without kicking it, just 4 little 1/1s, that's really good. Well, the problem is it has to be a target of the spell, so no, that doesn't work. So, but still, a 4 mana 4/4 that can still block a Questing Beast and kill it, that's nothing to actually underestimate now that I think of it like that. And if you do have the deck where you can target this and then create like a bunch of 1/1s, you are creating a lot of tokens with this card, especially if you can upgrade the power to it by using the kicker ability. That can lead to some Trumpet Blast, Alpha Strike like effects, which can help you finish off a game. So, it's definitely going to be a card that I think has potential for standard. Maybe if the blue-green kicker deck is a thing, they might run this card without a sweat, because, like, let's say you run that legendary Simic card we talk about, you kick it, and then you just remove 2 counters from that, and then you get 2, however big these things are, Myriad Constructs, which, actually, now coming to think of it, that's actually ridiculously absurd. Okay, note to self, put the Simic kicker deck as a janky brew that I'm going to try during the early access. Noted. Nevertheless, I do think this card has a chance for standard, but it's kind of hard because it pretty much dies through board wipes, and you don't get it has a weird death trigger where it has to be a target of a spell. So, granted, as long as it gets targeted by like an instant or sorcery spell, then the effect happens. I don't think it works with stuff like Banishing Light or Elspeth Conquers Death, I believe, because technically it's a permanent that's targeting it, so yeah, it doesn't work. So you have to make sure that you're in kind of like a spell-oriented deck where you can do a quick boop, target this, and then get your counters if it's going to be sacrificed and such. It's definitely one of the more interesting cards of the set. I do feel like if a standard brew is going to be, if the kicker deck is going to be a thing, it's going to actually have a fun interaction with this card and might actually be one of its core engines, so to speak. Maybe. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how that deck forms. So, overall, I like the card. I'm so curious to see how it's going to do in Standard. Like, it either can be really, really good, or it's going to be really, really bad. Speaking of making the kicker deck a thing, I am actually now starting to read this card, and I'm starting to realize the kicker deck might actually be a thing. Anyway, what is this card? Roost of Drakes. 1 blue for an enchantment. Okay, so 2 and a blue to kick it. Whenever Roost of Drake enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. Okay, that's good. However, whenever you cast a kicked spell, so pretty much anytime you cast a kicked spell, you then will create a Drake again. If I am aware of how this is worded, you don't have to have the spell kicked for this effect to go off. So if the spell has kicker on it, you do get the Drake token, I believe. If that's the case, then this card is kind of nutty. I'll put it like this. I'll go with 2 different interpretations because I'm not sure how the card works. If it's when you ever cast a spell that is kicked without having to do the kicker, or if even having to do the kick, so to speak, it has a choice and you still get the Drake token out of it, that's actually pretty decent. You can still play this on turn 1 without a sweat, play a kicker spell that just essentially just, even you don't have to kick it or such, still get a Drake out of it. That's really nice. This can just be a constant source of Drake, which is kind of silly. That's a really good token generation engine, and with the token generation engine, it seems like this blue-green kicker deck, either for limited, but also potentially for standard applications, like a go-wide deck, so to speak, which I can definitely see that being a possibility, especially when you have a token generator like Roost of the Drakes. However, if this is worded like I think it is, where it's the spell has to be kicked to get the Drake token, then the spell both becomes a little worse, but a teeny bit better in one weird circumstance. It becomes better in the sense that, let's say, for example, you will need to cast this for 4, essentially. And let's say you cast, like, that serpent we were talking about earlier. You cast the kicker, you cast the serpent, and then when this enters the battlefield, you create 2 copies of it, which then will, both with their ETB triggers, create the 2/2 blue Drake creature tokens. And then now, anytime you cast a kicker, okay. This is actually a lot more nuance to this card than I thought at first glance. So, yeah, if the blue-green kicker deck is going to be a thing, I think it's going to be more reliant on this card than you take at first glance. So, yeah, a lot better than I thought. So, Roost of Drakes, good card. Plus, also, it's a blue enchantment, so if the blue-green kicker deck goes into kind of like a constellation-style type of deck design, well, this is a 1-mana cheap enchantment to help essentially, like with your Cetesian champions, trigger it. So, yeah, that's a plus. Okay, I am definitely bringing the blue-green kicker deck after this. Next up, Shadow's Verdict. 3 and 2 black for a sorcery spell. Exile all creatures and planeswalkers with converted mana cost 3 or less from the battlefield, and all creature and planeswalker cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from all graveyards. Okay, as everybody kind of pointed out with this card, this is kind of the card that's supposed to, in theory, hate out the Uro and also hate out the Lurrus decks. I do think this card actually has one more application that people have remissed about, and I do think you do want to keep this in mind against the Cycling matchup. While the Cycling deck does have a lot of instant sorcery spells, they also run a lot of instant sorcery creatures and such. Most of them at the mana cost 3 or less. So, you can actually use this to, hopefully in theory, make the board significantly lessen to an extent, so that, and some of them do run Lurrus type builds and such, so the fact that when they play the Lurrus to try to replay the cards in the graveyard, you can just, during your turn, cast Shadow's Verdict, get rid of the Lurrus, get rid of all the creatures, and then hopefully make their Zenith Flare significantly less. That is something to be considerate. Now, granted, yes, the fact that this is a more costly a ritual soot is a little bit but the fact that this also target planeswalkers is very nice, even though a majority of the very really annoying free cost planeswalkers are technically rotating out. We still will have some, like the Royal Scions and such, so you gotta keep that in mind, but a lot of the more annoying free cost planeswalkers do rotate out. But still, it is nice that this can target planeswalkers, especially, it's a good kind of like a safety switch, especially if we get more cheap planeswalkers within future sets, so to speak. So, I like the card as more of a sideboard tech card. Maybe force the main board in best of one if you go against Uro after Uro after Uro, so to speak. But, we'll see about that. Next up, Grakmaw, Skyclave Ravager. 1 black and a green for a legendary creature Hydra Horror. It's a 0/0, but it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. And it has whenever another creature you control dies, if it had a counter on it, you put a counter on this creature. And then whenever this dies, you create an Etz black and green Hydra creature token where Etz is the number of +1/+1 counters on Grakmaw. On one hand, I do like this potentially for the Absen kind of like counter mattered decks. Like, some of them are mostly just sticking, like the counters matter deck is sticking mostly to the Selesnya style of deck design. Though, if you need a justification to go into Absen besides the really good spot removal that Absen has, this is another decent justification. Like, it's a decent free drop. All your creatures that have +1/+1 counters, if they get spot removed and such, it makes this bigger. So the opponent is forced to either deal with this first before it deals with your other engine pieces in the green-white counter deck, unless they have a board wipe. And it still has insurance in a sense, because if it dies with a counter on it, then essentially it will just become a free at most. Or, not a free at most, a free at least. Unless they do like some weird Heartless Act shenanigans. Which, yeah, Heartless Act does kind of kill this card, because what happens is all they have to do is just remove the free counters. This automatically kills the creature, and since the creature doesn't see any counters on it, no token for you, essentially. So, that's definitely something to keep in mind. And also, of course, this is a die trigger, so if any exile spells happen, you won't get the token out of it. But still, this is one of those cards where it's not amazing at first glance, but it is just a practical free drop, especially if you're doing the Selesnya/Absen counter decks. Like, you obviously have to go Absen to do the full effect of this, but I do think this is a decent creature. I don't think it's an amazing creature, but I think it's decent. At least something to keep in mind, just for the more jankier decks around. Competitive? Maybe not. Next up, a card that I really like, even though I don't think it's great, but it will be great in the Absent counter deck. Oranreef Ooze. 2 and a green for a 2/2. Okay, but when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So you can make this a free if you want, or put it on another creature that might synergize with counters, like, say, that Hydra we were talking about. But what does it do? Well, whenever this attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. I definitely like this card, I'm not gonna lie. I do like it because it does kind of like provide an interesting threat analysis regarding to the, if you even put this in Selesnya or the Absent counter deck, because then your opponent has to be very cautious and might try to remove this first, which then allows you to keep your other counter creatures alive in theory, which that's actually a really good thing to consider. Also, if we have any realm of haste enabling, which I think we have at least one, but then you have to go into Gruul if you want to do that. I guess granted, we do have Grumgully in the format, so that's actually something to consider. Okay, food for thought. Anyway, so essentially when you put a counter, the fact that this is a significant threat, because what it can do is when you attack with everything, it essentially be like, okay, I'm going to put a counter on all the creatures I have counters on it. That is just like a mini Anthem effect, and that is going to be very scary for your opponent. So if this can consistently attack at least once, you get your value out of the card without a sweat. And if it attacks multiple times, that is absurd. Plus, also, if we go into red and well, no, it's whenever it attacks, not deals combat damage, but still, I was almost going to make the Embercleave argument, but honestly, you're kind of overkilling it with the Embercleave if you're going to go wide deck with this. But still something to consider. But yeah, the Ooze is a significantly good threat in the counters deck. It's a lot more better free drop than the Hydra, in my personal opinion. But if an Absent counter deck is going to be a thing, then they're probably going to run both of these, most likely, if I'm being honest. Still, I do think it's a pretty cool card, plus the art on it is actually legit gorgeous in my opinion. Next up, let us talk about a card that, oh boy, this is a saucy rare. Fun fact: I actually discovered this on the WotC kind of like mothership and such a little bit earlier when they were posting and such. I did actually post this on Twitter, and oh dear, I'm still getting responses from that Twitter post. Apparently, I'm not sure if I was the first one on Twitter that posted, but apparently I was the first one where everybody was like, crab! More or less. So yeah, for people who are just discovering this series through that Twitter post, hi, hope you enjoy the card reviews slash also silly decks. Anyway, let us talk about this silly card, by the way. Cherish the Raging Isle. 2 and 2 blue for a 0/17. So, the biggest butt we have ever seen on a 4-drop. Yeah. Also, it has spells your opponents cast that target Chariots the Raging Isle cost 2 more to cast. Keep in mind, instant sorcery spells. Not like any, like. So, Elspeth Conqueror's Death can still kill this. So, keep that in mind. Slash also board wipes, etc., etc. So, but it does have an activated ability of 3, where it gets plus X, minus X, or until in a turn, where X is the number of islands you control. Okay, besides the silly applications that we just got a giant enemy crab as a card, this is actually a pretty good card if you need to be defensive. This is actually probably. And it's kind of funny as a joke because the majority of the crabs that Wizard of the Coast produce and like put in sets, most of the applications more in limited, and as everybody noted, they're mostly good if you're on the defensive. And this is like the mother of all defensive cards. A 0/17 is really, really hard to attack through. Like, there's not many creatures that can get through that other than, say, a questing beast due to the obvious factor that it's 0 toughness. But a majority of the early game, they are not getting past this giant crab. So that is the fact that it's just a giant defensive creature in that sense. It's a great card. Like, it's a great defensive card, and it's also one of those cards that I like to call the decoy card, where people are like, okay, I gotta remove this if I'm on the aggro plan right away and delay their turn. So yeah, it's kind of like a Planeswalker of Crabs in a sense, where opponents will first try to target this first so they can actually deal their damage in the aggro matchups. So that's kind of hilarious. And the best part is, in those aggro matchups, they can't use a burn spell, so they have to be like Rakdos, that spot removal. That is just, or have Death Touch, and that's actually really hilarious. Yeah, this is like the card that if you want to be like, hey, mono red, I don't want you to attack me. Here's my giant crab. I'm going to have fun saying giant crab over and over again, aren't I? Anyway, but the more sillier application of this card is actually there are some very funny combos you can do with this card, both in EDH, but in Standard as well. In Standard, we have a card called Solid Footing, which is a white cost enchantment that makes you attack with your creature that's enchanted with it equal to its toughness. So it signs its combat damage with its toughness. And so this creature is going to attack as if it was a 17 power creature. Oh, and by the way, Embercleave is in the format. In one of the jankier decks that I did brew is kind of like I call the Embercleave Ragoon deck, where it's essentially that basic premise. You are trying to Embercleave the giant crab while it has a solid footing on it to deal like a ridiculous ton of damage. So there's like silly, weird applications like that. Also, don't underrate combat tricks and such, kind of like pump spells and such, because that could also help out with this crab a lot. And of course, I won't say mono blue decks will like the card, but I do think they want to be a little cautious. Because, yeah, if you have. Okay, let's be frank, you're not going to have more than 17 lands, as many people are saying. Maybe in Commander, but in Standard, no. But you do have to be cautious and just make sure you keep in mind how many islands you have in play when doing this and doing combat math and such. So the Thatcher does have that activated ability so that you can attack in aggressively and it doesn't have Defender, which of course kind of hurts against the people who play Defender Matter style decks like that one Bant Dragon that I always forget the name of. Oh, what's his name? Someone will remind me in the comments. But yeah, that one. Still, guys, it's a giant enemy crab. It's the Timmy card of the set. And yes, I am going to brew around this card because it's funny. That's all there is to it. Does it have some potential standard application play? Absolutely. Like, if you need a very defensive creature, this is probably one of the best big butt creatures you're going to have in a while. That's all I'm going to say. Next up, this is actually probably one of the more cheekier rogues they actually produce in the set, Nimble Trapfinder. 1 blue for a 2/1 human rogue, and it can't be blocked if you have another cleric, rogue, warrior, wizard into the battlefield until you control this turn. So, you play this on turn 2, you play a member of your party or even the rogue, keep that in mind. If it enters the battlefield, then this creature gets the ability of not being blocked, which is nice. So, a way that if you have a consistent creature generation engine, you can constantly attack this as an unblockable creature. That's really good. But what else does it have? It has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, creatures you control gain, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card until end of turn. So, I'll put it like this. In the party deck, I am definitely tempted to try it out. I think it's more going to be a great party EDH card. In standard, though, I think you just put this in rogues. Maybe. Because in rogues, this is just a really good 2/1 that can be unblockable every time you play a rogue. Now, granted, a majority of the rogues you want to play have flash speed, so you want to play it with flash. But still, the fact is, you can still play some rogues during your main key to get this unblockable effect, especially when you have spells like Seraph and such. Seraph, that's the name. The legendary merfolk, where you can have this as your unblockable creature. You then switch it with Seraph and then get that attack rogue trigger essentially, which is really nice. So, but also I think in mono blue tempo decks this is also something to consider, especially if they have a number of these type of creature cards within their deck designs, like wizards and rogues. Mono blue tempo will like this card a lot because a 2/1 that can constantly attack in without being blocked, that's nothing to underestimate. Now the problem is it doesn't have hexproof, so it is prone to removal. Keep that in mind. But still, I do think this is a threat that people will answer, and when they answer that, you can just play your free cost threat or 4 cost threat to help, or even a bunch more earlier game threats, and just keep up with the tempo. So, I do like this card a lot. It'll be interesting to see if it gets seeds play in the rogue deck, but I think if mono blue tempo is going to be a thing, they are going to, especially if they have a number of rogues, they're going to like this little annoying 2/1 a lot. It's a card that I think it's more a good EDH card than standard card. Throne of McKindy. I think it's how you pronounce that. Forgive me if my mispronunciation. It's a legendary. It's not a legendary. It's a rare land. So the fact you can have multiple of these, granted, not going to matter in EDH, but in standard, I guess something to consider. It has a ability of tap it for 1, or you can 1 and tap it, put a charge counter on Throne of McKindy, or you can tap it and remove a charge counter from the throne and then add 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana only to cast kicker spells. Maybe? This is a card where I'm kind of leaning on the nay, but I will be a slight little optimistic. In a majority of kicker decks, you do want to have a lot of excess mana, in a sense, to be able to cast the kicker spells. A lot of it's going to be excess generic mana, in theory. So, you could make a roundabout argument that if you're playing this like in a blue-green control kicker deck, that you could have the Throne of McKindy out at the very least, and then if you don't need to counter something or tempo something, then you could just have a mana sink of putting the charge counter on this. I do like the aspect of this where this is a card where you don't have to have multiple charge counters to get the effect. You only just need to have like 1 charge counter, and then it's kind of like a temporary mana storage bank in a sense. And then on the turn where you do your significant kicker spell of sorts, then you can just essentially then activate the charge counter ability and then hopefully activate the kicker spell. That is probably where it's going to see most of its potential application. I think in EDH it's going to be really good, especially if you're playing the Halar kicker deck or the new Simic Snake kicker deck, essentially. If you're playing those decks, you're probably going to play this card. In Standard, I'm not going to discount this card, but I do think it's going to be one where you could maybe easily cut it out, especially since we have a lot of ramp in the format like Uro and such. So I don't know. It's one of those cards where I'm going to have to see play if I'm being honest. My gut instinct wants to say it's bad in standard, but I could be wrong. I could be really wrong about this card, so keep that in mind. Next up, a kicker card that I actually like quite a lot. Scatter, and also, hey, for the Halard EDH decks, keep this in mind. Shatter Skull Charger, 1 and 2 red for a 4/3 with trample and haste, but it has kicker too. So, if this was kicked, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So this can be a 5/4 with kicker, or a 5/4 with trample and haste. Okay. Oh, and at the beginning of your end step, if it doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to the owner's hand. This is a really interesting card, I'm going to say that. Because on one hand, you could put this into a kicker deck and just do the effect of just having a constant realm of 4 damage to the opponent if they don't have a defensive option, if they don't have a free and such. So you can constantly have this as kind of like a dash attacker, more or less. Is it as good as dash? In some instances, yes. In some instances, no. But even if you don't want to do the kicker line of this card, there is also a cheekier way you can use this card. You can actually throw this in kind of like a Grum Goalie Gruul aggro deck, or like even one that uses Renata. Pretty much have a creature that when another creature, non-human, hey, Giant Warrior, nifty, when this enters the battlefield, it's going to get the +1/+1 counter thanks to Grum Goalie or Renata. Thus, then it won't get bounced to your hand, and you have a 5/4 giant in play. That is still a really, really nifty effect to keep in mind. And if you have to cast it for its kicker cost, a 5/4 with trample and haste is perfectly fine. So, yeah, this will probably see play, especially in the aggro decks, because of even just as a 4/3 with trample, just constantly get 4 instances of damage in, especially if you're able to deal with the opponent's defensiveness. That's nothing to underestimate. So, yeah, you're probably going to see a lot of this little charger if, well, okay, I can't really say little because it's a giant warrior, but you're going to see this free drop probably a lot more than you think at first glance. Next up, as I mentioned before, there is one card that kind of got introduced for the last few days of spoilers and such that I do think it's actually a lot better than taken at first glance. And that is Relegats, a 2-drop artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, it has, of course, the effect that you can attach to a target creature you control. A creature gets +1/+1. If it's a warrior, it gets +2/+1 instead, and also has an equip cost of 2. This is surprisingly good. I do feel like a lot of the warrior decks are going to essentially be an equipment matter deck design, and this is a really decent 2-drop equipment. Especially if you have a majority of warriors. Like, imagine if you have that warrior lord, and then you play the Relegats. That lord now becomes a 5/4. And there's other really good 1-drop warriors that we are going to get. We're going to talk about one next up. That can essentially make the power significant. And even worst case scenario, if you're playing this in a deck where you have stuff like, say, Fervent Champion, the fact that Fervent Champion can easily become a 1/1 without a snap due to the fact that equipment costs 3 less, aka this will have an equip cost of 0 on it. Sure, getting a +1/+1 boost is not amazing, but still not bad. So, cheap artifact, has a very relevant effect, has a good tribal matter synergy, including the fact that tribal is kind of being very encouraged into the equipment-based synergies. So, yeah, good card. I actually like this card a lot more than taken at first glance. Speaking of a warrior that would be very nifty with that Relegats, the Fireblade Charger. A 1 red 1/1, so as long as it's equipped, it has haste. Okay. But still, it's just a 1-mana 1/1. But what does it do? Well, when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now, keep in mind, if this dies to something like a Grasp of Darkness or an Ouroboros' Intervention, you are not really going to be nifty with that die trigger because your power will be 0 at the time. However, with that exception, this card is actually a pretty good 1-drop in the warrior equipment deck because the factor is you can play this on turn 1, play the Relegats, and then this can attack as a free 2 on turn 2. That's really good. And also, if the opponent decides to block and kill it, oh, you're going to just shock anything that you want to right off the bat. So, yeah, I do like this little goblin a lot. Plus, the fact is, the more equipment you put on it, the more bigger it gets, and then your opponent still has the constant threat of, oh, what happens if this creature dies? And if they don't have any way to exile it, which, yeah, that is the con. If it gets exiled, then the effect doesn't happen, so you got to keep that in mind. But if you're playing the Equipment Warrior deck, this is an obvious for the 3 of, because it's just a really powerful 1-drop that gets a lot better the more equipment you put on it. So, yeah, good card in my books, to be honest. Next up, Class Pool Mimic. 2 and a blue for a 0/0 Shapeshifter Rogue. You may have this creature into the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a Shapeshifter Rogue in addition to its other types. Or you have the choice of this entering in as a tapped land. So, I like my clones, not gonna lie, and the fact that this is a Shapeshifter Rogue is really nice, especially since we're having a lot of powerful Rogue ETB trigger-like effects in Standard. So that's gonna be something to keep in mind with this card. Now, the fact that this can't copy creatures your opponents control is a little eh. But honestly, if you're playing like a clone effect like this, you're either playing this in a deck where you have like really powerful creatures that you don't mind having a second copy of, or you're playing this where there's a lot of ETB triggers and you don't mind copying an ETB trigger. Like, for example, in the Rogues deck, you're going to be copying, like, the triggers of milling cards constantly and such. Plus, using Glasspool Mimic to copy, like, that 2-drop Lord we were talking about before, since the Lords can stack, that can be ridiculously absurd. So, yeah, keep your eye on this. Obviously, if your deck would like a clone, you can play this. And even if you don't have the opportunity to play the clone-like effect, let's say your board is empty at the moment or such, the fact that you can still play this as a land is a nice plus. So, overall, I do like this card, and yeah, it's probably going to see play in blue-black rogues, most likely. Well, the last card before I retreat to my brewing shenanigans, and yes, I made this card last just so that I can have that pun, the Felidar Retreat. 3 and a white for an enchantment with landfall, and it has whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one. Create a white cat beast creature token 2/2, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. I think this is more of an EDH card. I like this for EDH, especially in EDH landfall decks, because they're going to have a lot of fun with this card. Especially if it's a format with fetch lands and all that, and stuff like Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and such. They're going to have a lot of fun with this type of card and such, because being able to just constantly, with like those type of fetch lands and such, being able to create a token and then get a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures and giving them vigilance, that is ridiculously absurd. Plus, also, there is the factor that you could put this in a standard landfall deck because ramp is still pretty good at the moment, and we have stuff like Migration Path and such as mentioned before. The only thing I the only thing I have a con of is this is more of a 5-drop than a 4-drop, because you kind of want to play this on turn 4 or play this on a turn where you can play a land as well, so you can at least get the ETB trigger off. Because if you play this by itself, it's technically doing nothing, and it's prone to a lot of enchantment hate / also permanent hate, aka Ugin, for example. So, yeah, I think like this might be potentially a little too slow for standard, but I could be wrong. I do like the card, but I do think it's one of those cards that you gotta have to wait and see if the format is slow enough that you can play this without much concern. If it's slow enough that you can play this card, then it's a great card. If the format is too fast, though, then I think this card is mostly going to see its shenanigans in EDH. Which, by the way, we are getting a Naya EDH deck that's landfall based, so this is a great addition to that deck. That's all I'm saying. And that is the whole Zendikar Rising spoiler review. Now, like I said, I skipped some cards. These are mostly cards that I think are either very fringe cards or more for limited. Keep that in mind. However, if you see me miss a card that you want me to ask my 2 cents about, you can contact me through my Twitter, which is PGD Hansen, or you can even ask me through the comments here if you want to. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, just please like and subscribe. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and get ready for the brewing shenanigans that Zendikar Rising is going to provide.